Hey guys, today is day 10. That means we're reading Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through chapter 5, verse 10. So just a little more than normal. Sorry for that, but we have to get through it. But in this reading, I'm really going to break it up into three sections. And so first I want to look at chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. And really, this paragraph, this little kind of three verses at the end, can be summed up in really three things that are needed as a high priest. You see, the writer of Hebrews, you're going to see a cycle where he mentions something and then later on he brings it back. So he mentioned high priest in chapter 3 and now he's bringing it back. He's going to mention a guy named Melchizedek and he's going to bring it back in a couple chapters. He's going to mention a priest king and he's going to bring it back in a couple chapters. And that's just kind of how the book of Hebrews goes. He brings it up and then he brings it back. But here he's bringing back up a high priest to show that Christ is better than Aaron and the high priest. And so the high priest we've already seen at, but we'll look at Aaron in just a second. But in verses 14 through 16, it really just sums up, there's three things that we need in a high priest. We see in verse 14, it says that since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, a high priest would enter into the temple one time of year to make atonement for the sins. But remember that the temple is just a man-made building in which God's Spirit inhabited. But Jesus was better than that because it just didn't enter a man-made building, but Jesus himself passed through the heavens. Jesus himself went before God to make the sacrifice. And so that's why he is better. In verse 15, it says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses." Just showing that Jesus sympathizes with our weaknesses. Jesus was tempted in every single way where Satan took him out after his baptism in the 40 days. So even though a high priest is a sinner, even though a high priest can understand what men and what women are going through, they don't understand every situation, but Jesus does. And then in verse 15, "But the one who in every respect has been tempted is without sin." He is without sin. Jesus knows every temptation because he was there with Satan, but he did it without sin. If you jump down to chapter 5 in verses really 1 through 5, it's really just a summary of comparing Jesus to this high priest. They're chosen among men. The high priests were chosen among men. Jesus was chosen among men. Jesus was chosen by God. Jesus didn't just say, "Hey, I want to be the high priest." God ordained that. God let that happen. In verse 2, it says he can deal gently with ignorant and wayward. Because the high priest was a man, he was a sinner himself. So he could deal with men and women like we just talked about. But Jesus was also tempted and tried, and he knew every situation, so he could do that. But we see in verse 3, because of this, he was obligated to offer a sacrifice for his own sin. When the high priest went into the temple, he first had to make a sacrifice for his own sin before he sacrificed for all of Israel. Jesus didn't need to do that, right? He was chosen. God chose him. He was tempted in every way, but he never sinned. So he never was a sinner. He fulfilled the Old Testament law. He fulfilled the covenant of God. And so he didn't need that. So that's why it makes him better. And then in verse 6, it says, as he says also in another in verse 7, "In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears." This is pointing to the cross. When Jesus was on the cross and he's sitting there, "Abba, Abba, Father, Father." This is the point. This is what the author of Hebrews is talking about, that Jesus offered up prayers and supplication in a loud cry, in a loud voice, and to him was able to save him from death. and he was heard because of his reverence, because of his holiness. Verse 8, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Now, when we read this, it's kind of weird because it is talking about Jesus, and it says that Jesus learned something, that he learned obedience. When we think of he learned obedience, it kind of means that in our mind, we kind of think at times that was Jesus disobedient? Did Jesus sin? And that's not what that verse is saying. It says that he learned obedience through what he had suffered. Jesus learned even greater obedience by taking on flesh, by suffering in flesh. And the book of Philippians says that he became obedient to death. That's how he did. So it's not saying that Jesus was disobedient. It's saying that when God, Jesus, put on flesh, that he learned another form of obedience to the Father, of going through suffering, of going through trials, of going through the cross. And then in verse 9, it says, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Being made perfect. Once again, we read that, we think, is there a time that Jesus wasn't perfect? Was he non-perfect and then he was made perfect? Once again, that's not what it's saying. It's saying that in being made perfect, Jesus being perfect, he became the source. It's not saying that he became perfect because he wasn't. It's just saying he became even more another source of perfection, not only for himself, but for us, that when we take on faith in Jesus, then we become perfect in the eyes of the Father. Now, I know this is a lot, and we're going to get into this more, kind of this temple and the priest and the king priest and Melchizedek. So I know you have more questions, but this is a really short video, but we're going to get into those later on in chapter 6 and chapter 7 when the writer of Hebrews brings them back. I hope you guys are enjoying this. We're in this. We had a great Sunday yesterday, and I am looking forward to continuing with this. God bless. We'll see you tomorrow.